Hello friends, my name is Host Eric and Coach Eric of Autonomy Debate School, and I'd like to provide for you guys a quick primer in argumentation in my professional capacity as a debate coach. So I'm going to bust it out fast and furious. If you have any questions, you can add them in the comments. I'd be happy to address them. This is how this first section of this is going. Assumptions, mechanics, basics, types, impacts, warrants, vectors. Okay, let's look over here. So, set up like this. Alright, so underlying assumptions of any sort of argumentation. Now, look, these principles are taken from debate, but debate is, in fact, argumentation that's designed for the purposes of being a competitive sport. So it's designed to be as fair and accurate and correct as possible. It's got to incorporate everything, right? Because when it's a competitive sport, then everybody tries their hardest to win, not to conform to a given party line or anything else, but to win. That may manifest as conforming to party line in certain circumstances, but it's to win. So let's go through this quickly. The underlying assumptions of debate. It is discursive in nature. That means that words mean some things and not some other things. Words have distinct meanings. Those can be challenged, certainly, but they have some boundary of meaning. Number two, assumes fairness through mechanisms. That is to say, it assumes that we agree to reciprocal burdens. If you get to support your claim by citing Leprechaun Whispers as a source, then I can cite Salamander Morse code as a source for mine. We agree that there's a shared metric, that it's possible to keep score accurately in this round, and to accurately ascertain a winner, provided both sides get equal amount of turns, and the debate goes on long enough, the one with the stronger arguments will win. Now, in a timed debate, as this is grown from, things play out a lot differently than in an actual public discourse. I'm aiming this particular presentation more towards the public discourse end of it than the actual formal debate competition end. So these are assumptions that we ought to have when we go into a conversation with our fellow citizens about public policy matters. We should assume reciprocal burdens. We're both going to only make the kind of arguments we agree our opponent can make those kind of arguments too. When I say kind, I mean certain vectors of arguments, which we'll get to later. And then the second one being shared metric, that we agree that one of us, it's possible to keep score. Now, you might agree, we might end it by saying, well, this person disagrees still, so therefore you haven't won. No. It means that therefore his position, whether he agrees with it or not, didn't win this discursive dispute. It lost because of very specific, describable, concrete, objective reasons. Okay, so the mechanics of the game of discursive argumentation are objects, moves, functions. Most moves are sets of words that establish warrants and impacts on the flow. The flow is the record of the argument. And this is true. Everybody has a flow for every argument they ever get into, whether it's written down or not. In their head, they've got a flow. They remember things. They've referenced back to them. If we all flowed all of our arguments, then we'd be in much better shape and be much more able to respond and keep score. In a formal debate, all parties flow, all the debaters and the judge flows. Okay, so once established on either flow, either side can build arguments off of an object. So each side has its own flow. It's saying, this is my case. The other side says, this is my case. This is not necessarily true in policy debate, but in almost every other structure, including the one we're talking about. It's true that both sides have their own flow, their own case. They've established certain things as true and pending rebuttal. So that's why we have a chance. We have to make sure we have a chance to answer a claimed impact. Functions are a type of move that changes the status of objects already on the flow. Usually the function will also establish new warrants and impacts to accomplish the outcome. Once established on either flow, either side can build arguments off of an object. Objects include impacts. That's saying, like, if we do what you say, 50 people die. Warrants. The reason for the impact. If we do what you say, 50 people die because it includes shooting people out of cannons at seals in the ocean, and it's almost certain to kill them. That's the reason why it's going to kill them. 3 ground arguments. Things like this isn't topical. The thing you're talking about is not that. You're talking about penguins, and we're talking about whether or not we should change this school protocol. And framework critiques those that say you're reaching your conclusions for the wrong reasons. Observations are statements of fact. Things like Los Angeles is closer to the Pacific Ocean than the Atlantic Ocean. It's indisputably true. Okay. So, as you go through a debate, you're exchanging claims, answers, and impacts and stuff like that. If I say we should invade Canada because there's no other way to get maple syrup, I've made a claim of what we ought to do. I've made a warrant why we ought to do it. I haven't really established the impact, but the impact is pretty clear. Without it, we all have no maple syrup. And my opponent says, actually, we get most of our maple syrup from France. And then what's happened there is I was tried to establish a warrant and an impact. The warrant being we should invade Canada because we need maple syrup and we have no other means of getting maple syrup without invading Canada. Therefore, if we don't do what I say, we'll be without maple syrup. And I point out that no, actually 80% of our maple syrup supply comes from France. Then your warrant has been toppled. So your impact no longer stands. So that whole argument chain is toppled. Impacts cannot stand without a warrant. Warrants can stand without an impact. Okay? So in this case, you've got nothing standing left in that argument because of the AT. The AT was defeated the warrant. It proved the warrant false. Now, if I come back and the other guy says, actually, the evidence you're citing is from 1984. Since the year 1990, we've gotten 95% of our maple syrup from Canada, and the other 5% was from Guatemala, but they just ran out of maple syrup. And here's a piece of evidence on it. Well, then, at that point, it's standing again. It's still not enough of a reason to invade Canada, but it's still standing. So, argumentation basics. What are some of these terms I'm talking about? You're probably getting lost already. Well, to affirm something is simply to state that it is true or advisable or that you are in favor of it. To negate something is to do the opposite. Say that it is not true, not advisable, or insufficiently established as desirable, and that we shouldn't do it. Not necessarily that we should do something else, but maybe that we should do something else. Resolution is the thing we're debating about. It could be a topic area in theory. It could be something like the United States should tax and spend. Plans and advocacies depend on the nature of the resolution or topic area. If you are doing a plan-style debate, I mean, that's the thing. Is if somebody says, well, look, nothing you're saying is practical, Eric, I say, well, I can give you a plan if you'd like. And we can have a plan debate, but I don't think you're prepared for that. And you're accustomed to arguing general advocacies. And my points stand regardless. All right, so the difference between a plan debate and general advocacy is general advocacy states how things ought to be, and how we ought to change on some gut, gross level. Like, in general, we should fix this sort of thing. Whereas a plan is proposing a specific legislation or specific action by a specific governmental agency or some other named agent. Okay, so the status quo is just the way things are right now before the affirmative advocates some sort of change. And then the flow is, as I said, the record of all the arguments made by the affirmative advocating the change and by the negation who's saying, no, let's not do your change is a bad idea. So the negation is in favor of the status quo over whatever it is you're proposing. That doesn't mean they might not also propose a counterplan, something to say, well, let's do this instead, but necessarily to be the negation, they have to oppose whatever it is you're affirming. So, okay, the framework refers to criteria, how we should judge this. How do we know when somebody's won it and what it means to win? That requires us to maybe have different criteria, and then we have to adjudicate whose criteria is better. Observations are simple facts and evidence that we should both agree on and not have to fight over. Definitions are ways of making ground arguments that say, well, you keep saying it's going to make elderly people's lives better, but you admit that it's going to involve crocodiles chewing on their legs. So I don't understand how whatever other benefits that might accrue from this process, can be said that they made their lives better if they disabled them from walking. You have to account for that or something like that. So that's a definitional ground argument, right? How are we defining the good? How are we defining, well, what counts as taxing versus a fee? What counts as, that's all definitional stuff. And lastly, there's the contention level argument. If we can agree on all that, we both agree that we should do whatever causes the most net good, and we both agree on all the definitions. Now, does this program actually cause net good or not, is a contention level argument. Assuming, that's called post-fiat. You assume that, pretend the plan passes, and see what happens. Okay, so there's different types of debate or different types of affirmation. And always the proposes we do something different. So there's always going to be issues of inherency, topicality, and solvency. Issues of inherency say, okay, well, you're proposing that we do something different. First of all, is there a problem in the status quo that needs to be addressed? Or is there an opportunity in the status quo that we can take advantage of to improve the status quo demonstrably? That's number one. Number two, is there a barrier in the status quo that your advocacy overcomes? For example, if I advocate, I know exactly how we can stop crime. From now on, guys, everybody just be cool. Okay? That has no inherency because there's no barrier to that plan already being implemented in the status quo, except, the plan would then have to be something like, I will, with the wisdom of my charismatic presentation, go around the country and convince everybody to be cool. That would be a plan, right? Because in the status quo, people are not all cool, and there's no reason to think they'll just become all cool because I mention it. All right, topicality. Topicality is the issue of, if you're trying to say that actually government spending is the source of jobs and wealth, and I say no, it's not, and then you try to establish that government spending is the source of money, like currency, then I will point out that there's a topicality issue here, because you made an initial claim as the resolution that the government is responsible for wealth and whatever else, and then I disputed it, and now you're making a different claim. That's not the same claim. You're saying now that it's currency. So before we move, we can talk about what that means later, but first let's have you acknowledge that you were wrong in your initial claim, that we negate that initial claim, that debate's over and you lost because you were wrong, because now you're negating a different claim and it's exclusive of the first one. So I'll assume by the rule of recency that you mean more seriously the one you're saying now than the one you said before. Okay. Solvency is the last issue the AF has to meet, which is if they successfully describe a problem and they successfully make arguments that are specific to that problem, and this could also be for a claim, right? So if you're saying the government is this way, it could be for a descriptive claim. You wouldn't really have an inherency claim, an inherency issue. But you still have solvency if you're claiming it ought to be that way. So solvency just says, is the thing you're advocating for actually going to fix the problem you're saying justifies the advocacy? So remember, you wouldn't advocate a change to the status quo if it were a perfect utopia. There'd be nothing to change. So obviously you have to articulate a problem first before you make a change. And then you have to explain how the change you're making actually fixes the problem, or at least helps it. Doesn't have to fix it completely, doesn't have to solve it, but has to improve it in some way or provide some solvency. All right, plans and counterplans. So there's one type of debate that includes formal plans, that's policy debate. That means you go in there with a shell of a plan that addresses all these stock issues and or has like a critique shell or something like that, informal debate. In life, what it means is, are you arguing for specific legislation or are you arguing a general advocacy? If I'm making a specific policy advocacy, then basically I'm offering a plan. I'm saying, no, the United States should do this in this circumstance going forward. That should be the behavior of the country to the extent that it behaves as a single agent. And when I'm making those kind of advocacies, then they're going to be a lot more toppleable. So you've got to be careful with those advocacies, right? The more specifics you give, the more places a person can attack. However, if we are aware of the scope of each of the requirements the affirmative needs to meet, then it's definitely meetable. Fiat means that we get to assume the AF plan passes and think about what it would likely do, what the impacts would likely be, as a way of determining whether it ought to pass. That means it's not a good neg argument to say, well, this will never pass, because we're not here to determine whether it will pass, but whether we should vote for it. You are drawing conclusions about what we will do before we've determined what we ought to do. And that's backwards. So that's why you can't deny AF fiat, because we're always arguing about what we ought to do or how we ought to perceive a given situation or something like that. Remember that debate is the tool of deliberative bodies for a reason, because as if you can make all sorts of arguments, but until others have had an opportunity to say why those arguments don't hold water or what potential conflict problems they cause, then you haven't done anything. Okay, advocacies, limits of fiat. You can't fiat a whole lot of shit if you're doing a general advocacy, right? So you can't say, well, let's assume that I can get the government to chip in $1 million here. Well, if it's general advocacy, for what? It's not specific enough to really fiat. But fiat still comes up in general advocacies for sure. If you were to say something like, well, yeah, the United States should engage in a more active bombing campaign in the Middle East because, like I said, we need to be more of a hegemon. That's my whole central point. So yeah, that follows logically from it. Well, now I've entered into the range of kind of a plan of sorts, and I am fiating that there's the political power or political will to get that done. You can't, as a neg, challenge that fiat because I'm making a general advocacy, because I'm offering something specific. To claim fiat, I have to offer something specific, which means that specific thing is subject to critique. Okay, so now let's look at the neg counterplans. Counterplans are, the neg doesn't have to argue, no, we shouldn't do your thing. They could argue, we should do this exclusive thing instead, and compare the two and say, my exclusive idea addresses your problem and avoids some disadvantages or otherwise does something else good, and we can't do them both. Now, the reason we have to have all that stuff, well, first of all, a neg counterplan has to be distinct from the affirmative plan. You can't just say, okay, well, now what you're saying is what I'm saying. That's not going to work. So you have to have it distinct. Sometimes people will attempt to do something called PICs, which are plan-inclusive counterplans. Those are basically the AF plan, but you change one or two words. And you say, no, let's do this instead. Those are tricky because you have to make sure they're exclusive of one another. We can't do both yours and ours. And even if we could, it's still tricky to do a PICs thing because you want your counterplan not only to be exclusive of the AF plan, but to be exclusive of affirming. Because if you don't have it being exclusive of affirming the resolution, then you may have them attempt to pull some sort of framework term that says, even though we didn't affirm through this way, the resolution has been affirmed, and thus you should give the round to us. So I'm wary of counterplans and general advocacies in general, but if you can come up with a counterplan that is exclusive of affirming the resolution, then you're fine. Note, you can perm any counterplan. So, well, let's do your counterplan plus my plan, unless they're exclusive. That's why exclusivity is first thing to be concerned with. Because if it's not exclusive, then you just say, okay, well, let's do both of our plans. Let's permute, and do both. All right, lastly, fiat issues. Neg doesn't have fiat, so they can't assume that their plan passes. The affirmative can say, your counterplan won't ever pass. And the F goes, well, your your plan won't ever pass. And, well, you don't have fiat, Nick. Remember who's advocating the change here? You're the one who decided to go counterplan, but play miniature AF. Well, you can do that, but you don't get fiat. So, not that those sort of process arguments are particularly strong anyway, but it's something to consider. General advocacies. How are general advocacies adjudicated? The debates. Well, it's either truth testing, where you say, no, this is not true, this sentence, or it is true. Or it's compare worlds, that the sentence in which we do this thing is better than the world in which we don't do this thing, or in which we do something different. You can say it's grammatically or a priori true, like, it's necessary that we affirm this resolution because to negate it would be to produce a logical contradiction, which means it's invalid to negate this, therefore we must affirm, or vice versa. You could do a political case that says, if we affirm this resolution, no matter how good my opponent's debate, we're participating in reinforcing an oppressive political structure, or something like that. Or you could do an intersystem K, which is basically a theory argument that says, I should win this debate because they've failed to meet these burdens, mechanics, or they violated this rule, or stuff like that. Okay, so that's the first 5 of these 8 sections. I'm going to save impacts and vectors and warrants for the next video, because we did make it all the way through types here, and we've got impacts, warrants, and vectors left, and that's at least its own video for sure. How long did this take? 20 minutes, 21 minutes. It's pretty good. It's pretty quick. May not have picked it all up, but it's a start. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.